everybody. Good morning here in Singapore and good evening to you, Professor Milani. I am Navid Fauzi, a research fellow here at the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. It's an honor to have you with us, Professor Milani, and thank you for accepting the invitation. As you see on the other screen, Professor Milani is going to talk to us about his most recent book on the Shah, and among many details about Shah's personalities and its relationship with the political developments in Iran, I guess we are going to hear why there was a need to write yet another biography on the late Shah among maybe up to 10 other biographies that exist. But let me start with giving you a little introduction about Professor Milani's education and publications. Professor Milani was born in Iran, and when he was 16, he started his education in California. In 1970 or 1971, I believe, he received his bachelor's degree in political science and economics from University of Berkeley. And when he was in 1974, he received his PhD in political science from University of Hawaii. Before the revolution, it was before the revolution, Professor Milani, after his education, returned to Iran and worked for a couple of years as a professor of political science in National University of Iran. But at the time, because of his political activities, he was imprisoned for 1 year. He stayed in Iran. Post-revolution, he taught for a couple of years, but he was banned from teaching and publishing as well. So eventually in 1986, I believe, he left Iran, and for 14 years, he had the political science at Notre Dame University in Belmont, South San Francisco, and at the same time, for 8 years, he was a research fellow at the Middle East Center of University, UC Berkeley, and later he moved to Stanford University, where he co-founded the democracy program, Iran Democracy Project at Hoover Institute. He is currently a visiting professor of political science at the same university, as well as his main task, I guess, is the chairmanship. He is the director of the Mohammad-Reza Institute on Iranian Studies. Among 20 books that Professor Milani has published, mostly in English, and some of them in Persian, the rest are translated into Persian, and up to 200 articles and essays and book reviews. Let me refer to a couple of them. I have some of them here. You're more than welcome to take a look. One of them is the topic of today's talk. The other one, a massive project that finished several years ago on eminent Persians. And it's a 2-volume encyclopedia, let's say, biography of important scientists, important political leaders, and so on and so forth, just post a war in Iran. And in 1984, I believe, Professor Milani has published one of his mostly reviewed and maybe criticized and discussed theses in a book on Iranian modernity that traces ideas of modernity in Iran to about a millennium ago. And if we have a chance, maybe he shared with us a little bit on that. And the book that we are going to hear about today is on the Shah, and specifically relationship between the Shah's character, personalities, his relationship with siblings and his memory of his father and mother, and the political developments in Iran. So as you see on the board, it's the relationship between the contemporary politics in Iran, let's say, and the late Shah's personality. Please join me welcoming Professor Milani, and I move out of the screen.
Good morning. Evening of yesterday here, so we are Monday ahead of us. I'm very thankful and humbled by a generous introduction. Let me begin by trying to explain why not biography of Shah, and then I try to give a sense of what the book is about, how it is relevant today. I think that the 1979 revolution in Iran, as many scholars have since pointed out, is really a very important event of the 20th century. Some people have compared it in terms of its consequences to the Bolshevik Revolution, for example. And at the center of that event, an event that I think moved the tectonic political plates in the Middle East and by extension through much of the world, stood the character of the Shah. And I think much of what has been written about has been either hagiography, praising him and singing his brilliance, or demonology, trying to portray him as a lackey of US imperialism, for example, a British construct, for example, as someone who embodied all that is wrong with Iranian history. I felt then, and I think the response to the book in Iran, and I'll describe that in a minute, clearly indicates that many people share their view. There hadn't been an account of him, a political account of him, that tried to look at him from a scholarly point of view, without bias, without undue rancor, or without undue praise. Call the evidence as the evidence indicates, praise him if there is praise to be made, and criticize him for the places where he is to be criticized. I wrote the book in English, as you saw there, but I also finished it, rewriting it in Persian. I finished that about 8 months ago, 9 months ago. And one of the earlier books I had written about the Shah period, called The Persian Sphinx, about Amir Abbas Milani, had become something of a runaway bestseller. It had gone into something like 30 prints. So there was anticipation that a book on the Shah would have a lot of readership as well. But at that time, the Ahmadinejad administration decided to ban the book. They banned Poveda after 30 prints, virtually. They banned the book on modernity. So I decided that this is 21st century, you can't ban a book. So I found a nonprofit organization that was willing to publish the book, but put it for free reading and free download inside Iran. And in the first 6 weeks when that site began to become operational, it had something like 10 million hits. The book has been downloaded from that site alone, about 35,000 copies. There are 6 other sites inside Iran who are allowing people to download a PDF version of the book for free. This is all, I did it all for free for inside Iran. We developed a program that would recognize your address. If your address was inside Iran, you would be able to read and download it for free. So the remarkable response that people have shown to the book, the curiosity they have shown, to me indicates more than anything else that they realized that he was a pivotal character. They realized that they still don't know enough about him. And I think one of the most promising things about modern Iran, today's Iran, is that the new generation of the youth, which is some 3/5 of the population, doesn't believe in ideological explanations of history. They have seen the fallacies of that kind of absolutist narrative of history. They recognize the relative, the contingent nature of historical knowledge, and they're looking for ways to assess themselves. What happened to Iran? assess themselves what role the Shah played. That's why I think it was necessary to write another book after about 10 or 11 biographies. And the fact that people have shown this rather remarkable curiosity about it, I think shows that there's still a lot more to be said. There are a lot of documents that I used in this book. There are about 60,000 to 70,000 pages of archival material from the American Presidential Archives, National Archives, the Public Record Office in England, the Archives Diplomatiques in France. I've used those in the book. I've put them all now at the library at Stanford for any scholar to use. Many of these were not available 10 years ago. As you know, in America, in Britain, there's a 30-year rule. Some of the most sensitive documents are only declassified after 30 years. Some of the documents were still classified when I began to write the book. I had to request the declassification. You can't write the history of the revolution and of the Shah unless, for example, you know what happened between him and the American ambassador, him and the British ambassador, what happened between the American embassy and the Iranian military, for example, what kind of contacts did Ayatollah Khomeini have with the Americans, with the British, with the French. These are only available in the last 3 years, 4 years, and more of them will become available. So I would hope that in future, others would write other biographies of the Shah, because I think he is a very important figure. So that's why I wrote the book, and as suggested in that generous introduction, The Eminent Persians is also about that period. That was a 4-year project. It's about 150 of men and women who did something new during the Shah's period. So in a way, the Shah brings to closure a trilogy. One was about his prime minister, Hoveyda, called the Persian Sphinx, the Eminent Persians, and the Shah. Now, I think studying the Shah is not only important for Iran and Iranians, because it is a very critical moment of their history, but in a way, the experience that Iran underwent and the experience that it is still undergoing has relevance beyond it. I think Iran was one of the primary examples of kind of authoritarian modernization that did not succeed. A very unusual coalition of forces came together to overthrow a modernizing authoritarian regime and brought to power a theocratic regime that was very much, initially at least, keen on reversing this modernization process. Ayatollah Khomeini was very clearly, in my view, decidedly a demodernizing force. He had made it very clear that modernity, in his view, was a Western concoction. It was not good for the Islamic world, and that he wanted an alternative model. So, in some ways, what happened in Iran, in my view, has relevance to what is happening today in Egypt, what is happening in Turkey, in Morocco, throughout the Muslim world. It is not limited to Iran. It isn't just because Iran, with Egypt and Turkey, are the three, I think, pivotal states of 20th century history of the Middle East. If you look at the modern history of the Middle East, what has happened in these three countries has been the bellwether for what happens in the region. But it also, I think, if we understand what happened in Iran, we can better understand the traumas, the turmoils, the perils, the promises of modernization, of authoritarian modernization. We understand the traumas, the turmoils, the perils of oil, the sudden oil boom, what it can do to an economy, even when we have the best of intentions. So that's why I think the book and understanding that experience continues to be important and relevant. Now, the character of the Shah plays a very critical, in my view, role in all of this, because both the progress that Iran made during the 70s, becoming one of the fastest growing, newly industrializing countries in the world, sometimes with a GNP growth of double-digit GNP growth, as well as the sudden collapse of the system cannot be understood unless we also understand his character. That's why the subject of the talk is character as destiny. In some ways, the Shah's character was very much responsible for both the progress that Iran made and the way that his reign came to an end. Very briefly put, he was the second of the Pahlavi dynasty. His father, Reza Shah, had come to the throne in 1925 after he helped with the help of another man by the name of a fascinating figure. They organized a coup in 1921 that overthrew basically the Qajar dynasty and began this process of authoritarian modernization. By 25, Reza Shah came to the throne, he overthrew the Qajar dynasty, and began a process of modernization very much similar in its fundamental rubrics to what was happening in Turkey. In some way, Atatürk was his alter ego. The only trip Reza Shah made outside Iran was to Turkey, and in the fundamentals of his modernization paradigm, he followed the Turkish model. And that paradigm, basically, that authoritarian modernization paradigm was that Iran is in need of serious infrastructural, economic, cultural change. It needs to have new industry. It needs to reform the agricultural system. It needs to have a technocratic urban middle class. It needs to have enfranchisements for women. It needs to have industrial base. The state needs to play a very critical role. All of these were part of the Atatürk-Reza Shah paradigm. And furthermore, Atatürk and Reza Shah also believe that this modernization paradigm will not be realized unless they limit the role of Islamic clergy in the cultural, judicial, educational system. That's why Reza Shah moved systematically, very much on par with what was happening in Turkey, to curtail the role of the clergy in the education system, basically secularize the education system, took away the judiciary, which they controlled, even took away some of their economic lifeline by taking over the VAT, the religious endowments. When the son comes to power in 41, and he comes to power because the Ally attacked Iran, British and Soviet forces occupied Iran, and they thought, with some hypocrisy in what they were suggesting, and some serious concern, that Reza Shah harbored pro-Nazi sympathies. And in order to abort the possibility of Iran becoming a Nazi sympathizer, they forced the abdication of Reza Shah, this very powerful, very charismatic figure who overshadowed his son, all the son's life, was virtually illiterate, but had very clear ideas about how to modernize Iran, had a major flaw, and that was his greed, and that led to his own wealth becoming a subject of enormous amount of controversy and headache for the son. So when the father leaves under duress, the son, 21-year-old, half educated in Switzerland, half educated in Iranian military academy, always under the shadow of his father, takes over and basically tries to follow that paradigm that I indicated. But one very important difference. The big important difference was on the role that he believed religion should play. He tried very early, very quickly, to mend fences with the clergy. He tried to reintroduce them into the cultural life of the country. And the reason he did this was, I think, twofold. One and foremost, it was a policy decision. Remember, 41 is the creation, 1941 is when the Iranian Communist Party, or the Tudeh Party, is created. very rapid growth, and the Soviet Union very soon becomes a major international force. So the Shah sees very much the main threat to his throne to come from the communists. In fact, he went to his grave in 1980, in his last book, still believing that the revolution was actually a communist revolution, not an Islamic revolution. In his answer to history, he says, you will see that the West was duped. This was not a religious movement, this was a communist movement. So what is the antidote to communism, he believed? And a belief that at that time was shared by many in the West, by many in Britain, by many in the US, by the CIA when it was created. The antidote to communism is religion. So the Shah began to form this alliance with the religious forces and began to allow them to re-emerge in the public domain, something his father had completely moved in the opposite direction. So the modernization paradigm that the Shah followed, as compared to his father, was essentially the same in virtually every aspect, except this role for religion. And after August 53, as you know, in August 16, the Shah flees Iran when he thinks that Mossadegh might be moving to arrest him. He had tried to dislodge Mossadegh with the help of the US and the help of the British and the help of the clergy. The clergy played a very important role in all of those events. But the Shah left Iran, but came back a week later and came back. Mossadegh was overthrown. And the Shah continued this process of reincorporating the religious forces in society, but at the same time increasing his own authoritarianism. He began to take more and more of the executive as well as the legislative, the foreign policy, oil negotiations, economic negotiations, appointments at the university, all appointments in the military were concentrated in his hand. I have a report from the State Department that I quote in the book that gives a list of all things that the Shah controlled in 1970, for example. And it's truly remarkable that one man can manage all of this. As I said, everything from every appointment in the military, every diplomat, every director of a university basically chooses the members of the parliament, has oversight all the cabinet, all the economic decisions, oil negotiations. The nuclear program is created virtually out of nothing with his design, his work, and his guidance, with the help of Ahbab al-Tamad, of course, but he is in the driver's seat. And as his authoritarianism increases, as his sense of his own importance increases, political space for all non-religious forces is essentially eliminated. There is no middle in the Iranian politics in 1970, essentially. There is very little room for secular opposition to participate in the political process. There is very little room for the left to participate in the political process. Even members of the regime itself, if you read the memoirs of one of the heads of divisions of Sabati, who's the head of the internal security, he says, although I am the head of internal security, there are things I couldn't say because we were worried that His Majesty would get angry. So that middle is completely eliminated. The only force that was allowed to participate in the cultural political domain were the religious forces. Now, the Shah had clearly clashed with Ayatollah Khomeini, had exiled Ayatollah Khomeini, had in his own mind suppressed, executed some of the leaders of the most radical element of the Islamist forces, the Fadayan Islam, the devotees of Islam. So he thought that he had allowed the thriving of a religious force that is essentially royalist in his own mind and essentially anti-left. What he failed to understand, what the West failed to understand, what Iranian secular intellectuals failed to understand, each for a different set of reasons, is that within this structure, there was growing also a radical element who saw itself as a claimant to power, who saw that it had a different paradigm for the future of Iran. And when the Iranian modernization paradigm, a la Shah, went into a crisis in 1977, and it went into a crisis, again, for a combination of reasons. Oil prices did not rise as sharply as the Shah had hoped. Iran, that was experiencing double-digit, we have these, if you don't move, my office lights go off. It was in Iran, of course, we would say it was a British conspiracy that the lights went out. But it was simply the motion detector. But the system went into a crisis and that crisis coincided with the Shah's discovery of his own sickness. In late 1973, he discovers that he has cancer. So his mood begins to deteriorate. He begins to increasingly rely on Valium to calm his jittery nerves down. He's undergoing chemotherapy. And the economy goes into tailspin because of the failure of the oil to increase as much as he wanted. And Jimmy Carter is elected president in the United States. Now, the Shah had always believed that democratic presidents were not in his favor. He had a very rough time with the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration almost came close to trying to organize an attempt, very much like in Vietnam, for example, to dislodge the Shah. Eventually, they decided against it because they figured if they move the Shah, the left will win, Soviet Union will win. So the Shah had a bitter taste about what the democratic presidents might mean for him. Now, in '77, Jimmy Carter, who had campaigned on human rights, comes to the White House. And the Shah, suffering from cancer, the economy going into a tailspin, the Shah decides to open up the system, virtually the worst possible time. As I say in the book, from Aristotle to today, it's been very well known amongst political scientists that authoritarian regimes face their most perilous moments when they try to open up. Because all of this pent-up anger, pent-up political desire that hadn't found an articulation, all of the failure to develop a civil society that can channel and that can control these political energies, when they don't exist, the system can easily go haywire. Just look around and you can see many examples. Iran is one of the first and the most incredible examples. So as the economy is taking a dive, the Shah decides to open up. And suddenly, this outpouring of political dissatisfaction unnerves him. And it's a political dissatisfaction because, as I said, his authoritarianism essentially eliminated the possibility of any political participation. He believed truly that he knows best how to manage the economy, how to manage society, and he had remarkable strides. I mean, if you look at Iran's economic growth, if you look at the cultural growth, the number of universities, the number of women in colleges, the number of engineers, all of these things helped with the oil money, no doubt. But Iran had, under his reign, for example, from 1960, let's say, to 75, a remarkable period of economic growth. All of these created in him this illusion that only he knows what is best for Iran. And because of his character, he has a classical authoritarian type character. Some of you might have read Theodor Adorno's book. It was a classic in the '70s and '80s. It's now out of vogue a little bit. He talks about authoritarian personalities. And authoritarian personalities feel very good and strong and feel very much in power when they are in power. And the minute they face what they think is a more powerful force, they lose the ability to make decisions. The same Shah that 1974 took on the United States, took on President Ford, took on Nixon on the issue of the price of oil. I mean, he really stood up to the British, stood up to the US, famously shook his hand, said, "Don't threaten us, we'll threaten you back," to the President of the United States. Suddenly, he went from this kind of authoritarian, powerful world leader that he thought he was, to someone who couldn't make the smallest decisions without first consulting with the US and with the British. And as he was most in need, because of his character, of support from the US and from the British, because he believed they were the ones who, with the possible critical role by the Soviet Union, the Shah believed that all the democratic demonstrations in 78, 79 were masterminded by the CIA, by the British, and they were, in his view, an attempt to force them to back down on oil. But the Soviets, in his narrative, took the driver's seat and won the revolution. So as he needs this support from the US most urgent because of his own character, because he is falling literally and metaphorically to pieces, the US is unable to give or unwilling to give the support he needs. I think essentially unable because the US administration is completely of two minds about what to do with the Shah. You have Brzezinski in the White House, who believes that the Shah should be supported and should be allowed to use force in order to stay and control the situation. You have the State Department, led by Cyrus Vance, by Henry Kraft and Iran desk, who believe that Shah is essentially an incorrigible despot, and the more you can curtail his power, the better it is, and the democratic movement might be a way to finally force the Shah into a constitutional role. And Jimmy Carter vacillates between these two, and if this is not bad enough a recipe, the US has sent to Iran at the time, as an ambassador, someone by the name of Sullivan, who knew nothing about Iran, who had served in your part of the world. If he had any expertise, it was in that part of the world. And he begins to essentially follow what appears to be more or less his own foreign policy. So you have at least 3.5 foreign policies. You have Brzezinski, you have State Department, you have Carter that vacillates, and you have Sullivan in Iran, who has his own views on how to develop the situation. That's how, when the Americans and the British realized, and they realized this more or less about the same time, that is in about October, November of 78, that the Shah can no longer stay, they begin looking for an alternative. In the famous phrase of the British Prime Minister to his foreign minister, he says, "We need to reinsure in Iran," verbatim quoting. And when they began to look for someone to reinsure, they began to look for a force that could hold the country together, make sure it doesn't fall into Soviet hands, has the capacity to manage the country. They realized, they concluded very soon that forces loyal to Ayatollah Khomeini are the ones who can do this. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini very cleverly also sent message, both in deed as well as in words, that he will not have any role in the future politics of Iran, that essentially he's going to be the shepherd for a kind of a national front. In other words, the followers of Mossadegh. In other words, the force representing secular Democrats, the force representing the bazaars of Iran, the force representing the Iranian middle class, that they would be the future government. The first constitution that was written for Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini had actually approved it is very much along the line of the Fifth Republic in France. There is no role, special role for the clergy as we now see in Iran. So a remarkable coalition of forces that includes the middle class, much of the technocratic class, much of the working class, much of the women's movement, much of the even the entrepreneurial class that had thrived under the Shah, basically come together to create what they thought would be one more step in this path of modernization. Iran had modernized the infrastructure. Iran had begun to modernize the economy. Iran was well on its way to a rapidly industrializing country. What was missing was the political component. What was missing was the democratic component. So this rather unusual coalition, and it's more or less, in the grand scheme, the same coalition that came together in 1905-07 to create the constitutional revolution in Iran. It is more or less the same coalition that supported Dr. Mossadegh in his nationalization efforts in 1951. It is the same coalition that in 1905-07 executed in Iran under the fatwa of the top clerics at the time, one of the top ayatollahs called Ayatollah Nuri, who had opposed the idea of a secular constitution. That same coalition came together in 1979, and this time, as their leader, they chose someone who in his writings had indicated that he was a follower of Nuri rather than the constitutional movement. The paradox of Iran's modernization and where the role of the Shah comes in is precisely the way the system was set up, that someone who was a demodernizer, someone who was a follower in writing very clearly, the follower of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, who had been executed, only Ayatollah at that time executed publicly on the fatwa of other Ayatollahs. Now that coalition, that same coalition, stronger in terms of numbers, in terms of social power, in terms of intellectual capital, but essentially the same coalition came to overthrow the Shah and chose as its leader a demodernizer, and chose as its leader a person that had very cleverly, very brilliantly, created the political infrastructure in Iran that went all the way from the most radical elements in Fadayan Islam, who had killed 3 prime ministers, who had twice tried to kill the Shah, had committed several other acts of successful terror, all the way from that radical group to the most apparently benign groups that studied the Quran in neighborhoods. They created schools throughout the country that had their own essentially religious curriculum. Ayatollah Rouhani, the leader of Iran, if you read his biography, he is exactly one of the earliest students in these schools that were created in 1960s, because the religious forces began to see that they need to create new infrastructure. Ayatollah Khomeini clearly worked to create this new infrastructure, to create a coalition of Islamist forces, but also to offer a new version of Islam that was appealing to the middle classes, that could be appealing to the university students. And it was that combination, and that combination was made possible again because the Shah's paradigm that indicated that the religious forces were the antidote to his main enemy, the left, that turned the events the way they turned out. What added element, the last point that I will make before I try to see whether we can engage in a more conversation, is the Shah's own religiosity. The Shah, in my view, was a profoundly religious, in spite of his appearance of secularism. he truly believed that he had connection to the divine. As late as 1975, he told Oriana Fallaci that in the most perilous moments of my reign, I basically received divine guidance. In his memoirs, he mentions 3 experiences, sort of supernatural experiences, where he is saved from mortal disease by the saints. I know from many very reliable sources that all his life he carried a little Quran that his mother had given, one of these Qurans that have been miniaturized. It's very popular in Iran. They put it in around children's neck. It is to keep away evil eye. And his mother, the Shah's mother, who was herself profoundly religious, who believed in the power of prayer, believed in the power of nat, of giving money to the poor as a way to buy your safety or as a way to entice divine forces to work in your favor. The Shah very much believed in this. When you read his writings, and as I did, I read, there were about 13 volumes of his speeches and interviews and writings that I read. It is remarkable how often he talks about this religious component. So here, his own religious beliefs augmented the paradigmatic view that he had, that he needed religion to fight what he thought was a major threat to his throne. We have to, again, to give him credit, we have to remember that even after 1979, for example, if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, the United States, even after 79, believed that religious forces could be used to thwart communist expansion. Out of that vision, we have what got in Afghanistan. It was the same paradigmatic view, augmented by this personal religiosity, and then made more complicated by the unevenness of this character. That's why I have compared him to, throughout the book, every chapter begins with a quote from Richard II, Shakespeare's Richard II. I think he is really remarkably like Richard in terms of his character. Richard II was very bellicose when he felt in power, and suddenly collapsed when he thought that his critics have amassed a force around him. But he was also, I think, comparable to Richard for another reason. That's one of the reasons I did every epigram from Shakespeare. Shakespeare, too, comes at a time where monarchy and modernity have come into conflict. Modernity is about social contract, is about popular sovereignty, is about people having the right to elect their government and to change their government. Monarchy is essentially about divine legitimacy. It's about inherited legitimacy. That's why, with the advent of the modern age, monarchy is going to protracted crisis. Iranian monarchy was in a crisis when the Shah came to power. From 1840, Nasser-al-Din Shah, from the time Nasser-al-Din Shah comes to power, till the time Mohammad-Reza Shah comes to power, not a single king except one had lived and died peacefully inside Iran. They had either been assassinated by Nasser-al-Din Shah, by Islamic forces incidentally, or they had been forced into exile and died in exile. The only person that was an exception was Muzaffar-Din Shah, the king that accepted the constitutional revolution. In West, in the time of Shakespeare, monarchy begins to go into this crisis because you have the rise of popular sovereignty. Machiavelli brilliantly recognizes the age of inherited legitimacy have ended. The new prince, he says, must create his own legitimacy. The Shah comes to power at a moment where the institution of monarchy in Iran is undergoing, I think, a historic crisis. Part of the reason that the Islamic Republic is still in political crisis mode is that that notion hasn't yet completely been given up. The idea of divine and sovereignty of the faqih is even more profound re-articulation of what the Shah believed in terms of divine legitimacy of the king. Although he came to power at a very prosperous, although he ruled at a very prosperous time, although he commissioned many books about Iranian history. In 1971, they commissioned 2,500 books about different aspects of culture, history, politics. But during that entire period, we don't have a single book written or commissioned by the Shah or by the court or by intellectuals connected to them that describe to the Iranian people why monarchy is the best system for them at that time. If you look at when the system went into crisis in England, I looked at the century before and around the time of Shakespeare. Within 120, 30 years, there are 300 texts, either written, about 300, either written by kings or commissioned by kings, that somehow try to legitimize why modernity and monarchy can coexist. We don't have a single one of these during the Mohammad-Reza Shah's period. He believed, and he constantly repeated, that there is a mysterious divine connection between the Iranian people and monarchy. He said monarchy is the natural order of things. Monarchy is the most natural system. And the Iranian people, in their wisdom, have recognized this, and that's why he didn't feel like he needed to offer a kind of legitimizing narrative. By the time he realized the crisis was serious, it was, I think, too late. And Iran went into the convulsions that it did. The reason I said understanding that past is relevant today is because, in my view, that very same coalition in general rubric that overthrew the Shah in '79 is still trying to get what they were fighting for then, which is more democratic, more modern society where there is gender equality, where there is religious equality, where there is popular sovereignty and people have the right to choose and dismiss their governments. So in a sense, understanding why the Shah went and how he went helps us, I think, understand why Mr. Rouhani was elected, for example, and why this battle continued, in my view, till the dreams of '79, which are essentially the dreams of 1905, which is essentially a democratic Iran, will be realized. Every force that fought for this idea in 1905 is much stronger today than they were in 1905 or 7, or 1951 when Mossadegh came, or 1979. And there is one added, in my view, critical difference. The Iranian women have taken the leadership position of this movement, unlike any other time in this 100 and odd odyssey of democracy. So to me, that is a very promising aspect of the future, and part of this leadership role was made realizable because of the changes that were brought during the Mohammad-Reza Shah period. 1963, the recognition of the woman's right to vote, for example, soon after the right of women to be chosen to elected office. All of these, in my view at least, were not the creators of the women's movement, but the recognition of its power. But that movement is now at a place where, in my view, when the history of this democratic transition will be written, it will be said that at some moment this last 30 years, women took the leadership position. And to me, that is a great thing to look forward to. Thank you very much.